Welcome to another SY4 World Sociology screencast focusing on urbanisation. And urbanisation is a term used to describe the movement of people from rural areas to urban areas, and it's one of the key processes that affects development. And the 21st century could be called the century of the city. There are now, for the first time in human history, a situation where the urban population outnumbers the rural population. So there are more people around the world living in cities rather than living in the countryside. And this is a big change. So in 1950, there were just 86 cities in the world with a population of more than 1 million. And by the year 2015, it's estimated that there will be at least 550 cities in the world with a population in excess of 1 million. And the most urbanised area in the world is Latin America, which we can see on this map. And we've already reached a situation where 80% of the population in Latin America live in urban areas, and it's estimated that by the middle of this century that will go up to 90% of the population. One of the biggest cities in Latin America is Sao Paulo, which is the biggest city in Brazil, and this is a photograph of Sao Paulo in 1911, and when this photograph was taken it had a population of around about 250,000. And this is a photograph of Sao Paulo today, with a population in excess of 20 million. And this is a satellite image of Brazil, and we can see that most of the population live in large towns and cities around the coast, and the two biggest cities are Rio and Sao Paulo, and geographers are already talking about these cities beginning to join up. So geographers talk about the Rio-Sao Paulo extended metropolitan region, which includes the medium cities that are beginning to connect the 500-kilometre transport access between Brazil's two largest cities. And in our last screencast we talked about world population growth, and what we can see from this image is the fastest growing section of the world's population are people who live in urban areas in less developed countries. And one country that's undergone a particularly rapid phase of urbanisation is China. So we can see that in 1949, the urban population of China was just 11%. By the end of this decade, it's estimated to be well in excess of 60% of the population. And of course, many of the city dwellers in developing countries end up living in slums. So there were 1 billion people estimated to be living in slums in 2005, and by 2030 it's estimated that 2 billion people will be living in urban slums. And these are often referred to as shanty towns, or in the case of Brazil, they're referred to as favelas. And the United Nations defines a slum settlement as a household that cannot provide one of the following basic living characteristics. So firstly, a slum area might not provide the population with durable housing of a permanent nature that protects against extreme climate conditions. So poor housing units are of course very vulnerable to natural disaster and destruction because affordable building materials cannot withstand earthquakes, landslides, excessive wind or heavy rainstorms. So slum dwellers are at much greater risk to disaster because of their vulnerability to Mother Nature. And certainly in the case of the Haiti earthquake of 2010, slums compounded the severity of that natural disaster. And in the recent typhoon in the Philippines, the 44% of the urban population who live in slums were obviously the most affected. So the plywood and plastic sheeting of their shacks offered no real protection against 200 miles per hour winds. A second characteristic of slum areas, according to the United Nations definition, is they may lack easy access to safe water in sufficient amounts at an affordable price. And then thirdly, slum dwellers may not have easy access to adequate sanitation. So they might not have access to private or public toilet facilities shared by a reasonable number of people. A fourth characteristic of slums, according to the UN definition, is they suffer from overcrowding. So slum dwellers may not have access to sufficient living space, which means not more than 3 people sharing the same room. And the fifth characteristic of slums, according to the UN definition, is slum dwellers may lack security of tenure that prevents forced evictions. So slum householders are often subject to arbitrary rent increases, unreasonable restrictions on the use of their homes, and evictions carried out sometimes with the use of excessive force and often with no notice or consultation. So given the challenges of living in these urban slums, why do so many poor people in developing countries choose to migrate from the countryside to the city? Well, we can identify 2 main sets of factors. Firstly, they're what we call push factors. So these are aspects of the lives of poor people in the countryside that are very negative and encourage them to move away to the city. And these would include things like food shortages due to recent poor harvests, deserts expanding so that less land is available for crop growing, a lack of job opportunities, poorer health, including higher rates of disease and lower life expectancy in rural areas, and also a lack of educational opportunities. And then there are also what we call pull factors. So these are things in the target place, in the city, that encourage people to move there. And examples might include the availability of a greater range of employment, higher rates of pay, universities and secondary education for children's education, better hospitals and clinic facilities, access to new technology, and the perception that these are more exciting places to live, and the hope that there will be a better future if people move there. Of course, a reoccurring theme in the World Sociology course is the impact that climate change has on development. And climate change is one of the key factors influencing the migration of poor people from the countryside to the city. So, for example, unreliable rains due to climate change leads to poorer grassland for livestock and might force farmers to leave the countryside. Now, despite the challenges of urbanisation, there are some sociological perspectives who are very positive about this process. So modernisation theorists, for example, would argue that urbanisation is part of the process of poorer countries becoming more like us. And they would highlight positive economic and cultural roles played by the growth of cities. So, for example, in terms of their economic role, they provide a concentrated workforce for newly industrialising nations, and also in terms of their culture, moving to cities allows individuals to break free of the traditional constraints of their culture. So from this positive perspective, far from being a disaster, urbanisation is actually an opportunity to tackle poverty that would not be possible if the same number of people were dispersed across the countryside. So, for example, what we can see in this photograph is a community midwife visiting a family who live in a slum area of Mexico City in Latin America. And this highlights one of the big advantages of urbanisation. It's obviously much cheaper and easier to provide these kinds of services when you have a concentrated population in an urban area. However, in his book Planet of Slums, Mike Davis argues that urban growth has happened too fast in the developing world, and he emphasises a number of negative features of this. And in particular, he argues that in most countries, instead of being a focus for growth and prosperity, cities have essentially become a dumping ground for a surplus population who are no longer needed in the countryside, who move to a city, who find themselves either unemployed or underemployed, and when they are working in unskilled, unprotected, and low-wage informal service jobs. And this urban slum that we can see here in Mumbai in India is visual evidence of the point that Mike Davis is making about urban growth happening too fast in the developing world. And it is certainly the case that cities in developing countries make visible the extreme inequalities that usually exist within these countries. So as Robert states, modern skyscrapers, sumptuous shopping, office and banking facilities coexist with unpaved streets, squatter settlements and open sewage. The elegantly dressed are waylaid by beggars and street vendors, their shoes are shined and cars are guarded by urchins from the slums.